Hello, and welcome to this lecture on secondary growth and woody stem anatomy. All right, so we're just going to jump right into it. What is wood? Um, a lot of people think of wood as kind of a single, kind of simple material, but wood is actually really, really complex, okay? It's not just that stuff that comes from trees. Wood is doing some really, really amazing things for um, the plants that produce it. And we will be exploring a lot of those things as we move through this lecture today. First, just a review about herbaceous versus woody and what those terms mean. Herbaceous stems are the soft stems of most green plants. They're fleshy rather than being woody. So they're soft, they're poorly lignified. If you don't know what lignin is, we will be discussing what lignin is farther along. Herbaceous stems also tend to have separate vascular bundles. Once again, we'll take a look at that in some of the coming slides. And herbaceous plants also tend to see limited secondary growth, meaning most herbaceous plants are not very good at thickening their stems. Most herbaceous plants are kind of producing temporary above ground structures anyway. They're either going to frost down to the ground or they're going to propagate themselves. And they basically are always growing new stems. And so it doesn't really matter if they thicken them or not. Woody stems, on the other hand, are hard. They are reinforced structurally. They're also heavily lignified. Lignin, like I said, is a compound we'll talk about farther along. They usually have vascular bundles which are united into one continuous ring, and they are going to see extensive secondary growth. They're going to be capable of thickening their stems substantially. Um, Primary growth occurs at the apical meristem. So that is the tissue at the very tip of the stem where cell division is occurring and where new cells are produced, and then those new baby cells are inflated with water, and that causes the elongation of the stem. Stem elongation only occurs at the stem tips, okay? Primary growth. Secondary growth occurs at a secondary meristem called cambium that wraps around the circumference of the woody stem, and that is going to basically produce new layers of wood and a bark, and that's going to result in a thickening of the stem. We'll see exactly how this process occurs as we move forward in a little bit more detail. Um, okay, so monocots. I wanted to discuss them with just one slide because monocots are interesting. There are some examples of woody monocots, like some species of yuccas, most famously palms. There are a lot of woody palms. Not all palms are woody. Some of them are mostly herbaceous. Um, but monocots really don't have wood in the same way that like dicots or conifers do. Um, Monocots typically don't perform very much secondary growth. There's a big caveat on that. There are some species which are capable of doing some secondary growth, but we're not going to get into the nitty gritty botanical weirdness of that. Um, so the thickness of the trunk of a monocot is almost always determined by primary growth. So when you look at a palm tree, or I should just say palm, when you look at a palm, like these Washingtonia palms in the top image on the slide here, you can see that the trunk is the same thickness from the apical meristem all the way down to the ground. And that's because that thickness of stem is the thickness of stem that is developing at the apical meristem. They just have basically a massive apical meristem. So almost all of the stem tissue is from primary growth, not from secondary growth. So those stems don't have the ability to get thicker over time. They also, another feature of monocots, when we look at herbaceous monocots, we see that the vascular bundles are arranged in kind of a scattered pattern throughout the stem. And that's also true of our woody monocots. The vascular bundles are scattered throughout the stem, which means there are no growth rings. Um, if you cut down a palm that is 50 years old, you would have to have a record of when it was planted because the trunk won't tell you. You cut it open, no growth rings. So something to be aware of about monocots. In the sense that they're the stems of woody monocots are lignified. Yes, they could be considered wood. Sometimes, like coconut timber is used for construction, but overall, it's kind of debatable whether or not monocots have real wood because while it is lignified, while it can be used for construction, it's not really the result of secondary growth. So that's kind of something that's debated about whether or not palms are really even trees or whether they really have true wood. That's why I've got monocot wood in parentheses for the title of the slide. Kind of debatable, kind of depends on your viewpoint about what wood really is. Dicots, on the other hand, they usually perform extensive secondary growth. So um, most of the trunk thickness is not determined by primary growth. Usually dicots are producing relatively thin new stems, and then those stems thicken substantially as a result of secondary growth around the circumference of the stem. When you look at an herbaceous dicot, if we look in the bottom left-hand corner, I've got a microscope slide image of a cross section of a stem of an herbaceous dicot, and you can see the vascular bundles are arranged in a ring. And within each ring, we've got a little band of like purple phloem on the inside aspect of each one. There's a green stripe down the middle called the cambium. And then on the outside, we've got this little clump of tissue that stains red. And it's super important to notice that that purple xylem is on the inside. We've got that green layer of cambium in between, and then the phloem on the outside. The cambium layer between the two produces new xylem on the inside and new phloem on the outside. And what woody plants have done is they have taken this original setup and they've said, what if I united all of my separate vascular bundles into continuous rings, a continuous ring of phloem on the outside, a continuous layer of cambium just inside that, and then within that, a continuous layer of xylem. And what that has allowed woody plants to do is then produce these continually growing, layers of wood every single year as they add a new layer of xylem on the inside. Um, which is, yeah, basically how that works. So each ring, I'm sure we've all counted tree rings either as adults or children within a tree. Every additional ring represents 1 year of secondary growth. So when you look at the trunks of woody dicots or the branches, you can see that there's a substantial amount of taper. We go from these huge, thick bases of the trunks all the way up to these skinny, skinny branches at the tips of the branches. And the reason why we get the taper is older stems within the same plant, they've been adding wood, layers of wood for more years compared to younger branches. And so there's usually significant taper that's not usually seen in the trunks of monocots. Um, the climate has a big impact on the addition of these growth rings. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about some features of the growth rings later on. But not all not all dicot trees do have these defined growth rings. So looking at this top image, if you try to focus in on any given ring, you'll notice that it kind of blends in with the rings around it. You can't like follow a defined ring with your eyes all the way around this top um, tree cookie because there are no real defined rings. This top wood sample is from a tropical hardwood, probably from a rainforest. And because the growing conditions are ideal year round in a tropical rainforest, a lot of tropical rainforest species don't really have well-defined rings. They basically just grow when they feel like it, when the conditions are right, when there's enough nitrogen in the soil, when there's a heavy rainfall. They just are constantly growing, and that means you can't really age a lot of these trees. It can actually be really challenging to study how these trees respond to the environment over their lifespan because of that. Um, Most trees, however, both trees which live in tropical, wet, dry climates and also temperate hardwoods, they produce really clear annual growth rings. The growth is going to stop when conditions are no longer suitable. In the tropics, that's because it's dry, a dry season, like on the savanna, or in a wet, dry tropical forest. And then in the temperate zone, we obviously get very cold winters, both in the northern hemisphere and in the far southern hemisphere. So that leaves a really clear growth ring where the tree, you know, grows, then stops, grows, then stops, grows, then stops each year. As we move forward, we're going to start looking at different tissues that are kind of arranged in different ways within the trunk. So I think it's valuable to discuss some of the different planes so that we understand where we are and what we're talking about. There's a lot of different ways you can cut a woody stem in order to examine the tissues. The first we'll talk about is the transverse plane. This is a view formed by cutting the trunk at 90 degrees to the axis of the trunk. So if you were to um, take two transverse cuts through a trunk, you would create a tree cookie. Um, and that is actually what we're going to look at in our lab this week. Um, the radial plane is just what it sounds like. It radiates out from the center of the trunk out to the bark. So the radial plane can really exist in any directions so long as the middle of that plane is the center of the trunk. So think about that as like a pie slice. When you take a slice of a pie, the side of the pie slice would be a radial view um, because the pie slice radiates from the center out to the crust of the pie. A tangential plane is formed by cutting a face from the side of the trunk. So if you imagine that relative you hate at Thanksgiving, taking a knife and just cutting a pie into strips rather than cutting the pie into wedges, that's kind of a tangential plane. You're just looking at the inside of the trunk from these, faces that have been cut off the side. Obviously, that's an evil way to cut a pie, but that's a good way to get a look at certain types of tissues within a trunk. Um, okay, tissue layers of a woody dicot. So we're going to be looking at several different portions. I'd like to kind of emphasize that really everything inside of the cambium, remember the cambium is this tissue which makes new xylem on the inside and new phloem on the outside. Everything inside of the vascular cambium is called wood. Everything outside the vascular cambium is referred to as bark. So we'll be looking at the wood, and then we'll be looking at the secondary meristem, which is called the vascular cambium, and then we'll be moving out to the bark. So we'll start at the center and work our way outward. Okay. So xylem is the innermost tissue of our tree trunk, and there are a couple main functions the xylem has. Xylem transports water and mineral nutrients from the soil up to the leaves. That's where our plants are getting the water that they need to do photosynthesis and transpiration, and also the mineral nutrients that they need to do things like make chlorophyll. Um, the xylem tissues are not living. They're cells which, once they develop, the plant actually kills off those cells and reabsorbs all their contents and leaves basically empty tubes. And these empty tubes, like cells, are really effective at transporting water up the stems, up the roots, stems, and into the leaves of a tree. Um, when we look at a woody trunk, there are kind of two different zones of xylem within a woody stem. There's the heartwood and the sapwood. The heartwood is older and it's typically towards the center of the trunk. It often has a darker color, and that material no longer transports water or mineral nutrients. Um, we'll talk about some of the ways or some of the reasons why heartwood doesn't continue to transport water and mineral nutrients as we move forward. Um, Outside of the heartwood, we have the sapwood. This is younger xylem tissue. It's still dead, right? Or this is still xylem, right? It transports water and mineral nutrients, but it's active. It's active in that process. It's still allowing water to move through. Um, big question here that we're gonna, I guess, learn the answer to is why does the sapwood turn into heartwood? Because all sapwood rings eventually become heartwood. The tree continues to get thicker. Sapwood, the innermost sapwood layers become heartwood over time. Um, why couldn't a tree build a trunk in which the sapwood remained functional indefinitely? Why can't we just have all sapwood and no heartwood? Um, it's kind of a complex answer, and it's one that we'll look at throughout the entire unit. So in order to understand why sapwood becomes heartwood, we have to do a little bit of a review about xylem itself. Um, so if you remember from our unit on stems, just basic stem anatomy, you'll remember that water is not pumped. There's no water pressure. There's no positive water pressure that's pushing water up the stem. Rather, water is being pulled up the stem. It's evaporating out of the leaf. The water molecules have a lot of adhesion forces that stick them together. Sorry, cohesion forces that hold them together like surface tension, right? And so that pulls up this column of water molecules up the xylem. Um, this results in an extremely low pressure environment within the xylem tubes, up to negative 16 atmospheres, which is really, really low. That's 16 times lower than the atmospheric pressure at sea level. And water can do some really, really weird things at really, really low temperatures that can end up impacting the functionality of those xylem tubes. The biggest and probably most destructive thing that can happen is cavitation. So you might be wondering why I have this GIF of a breaking bottle, right? What's happening here is the person who's filming this, they are slapping the palm of their hand down onto the mouth of a bottle which is partially filled with water. And what that causes is a rapid acceleration of the bottle, but due to inertia, though it takes the water a second to catch up, right? So basically what's happening is the water's staying still, but the bottom of the bottle is pulling away from the water very, very rapidly, and it creates this extraordinarily low pressure zone. And in under those very low pressure conditions, the water spontaneously becomes a gas at room temperature. Um, and then when those bubbles collapse, it obviously breaks the bottle. That's more of a problem for engineers. But in this case, in xylem tubes, if the water pressure is negative 16 atmospheres, it really should be boiling because there's not enough pressure kind of smashing that water together anymore. So it wants to expand and turn into a gas. Um, the problem is that that is a phase change, and that requires the either activation energy or presence of a nucleation site, such as some kind of imperfection in a xylem tube. Um, if an air bubble forms, that blocks water flow through the xylem, and basically the xylem tube has permanently hydraulically failed if that occurs. There are a couple different things that can cause cavitation or an air bubble to form within a xylem tube, and those cavitation bubbles often lead to an embolism. If we look at this little diagram in the bottom left-hand corner, we can see that there are two different pathways here to an embolism from a functional xylem tube. The top one we'll look at first. So when water freezes, it forms ice crystals. And then as it thaws, um, air bubbles can form on those ice crystals because they provide a nucleation site, and those air bubbles can then embolize uh, a xylem vessel, which obviously the plant does not want to occur because it reduces the ability of the plant to move water, and therefore the number of leaves the plant can have. The other way that an embolism can occur is through drought. So if we look at the bottom pathway in this diagram, you can see that we go from a functional xylem tube. It says increasingly negative pressure. The only thing that could make the pressure lower would be, extreme heat or drought. And under drought conditions, if we don't have enough water to pull up to replace the water that we're losing from the top of the plant, then the pressure gradually becomes lower and lower and lower, and eventually the vessel can just suck in air through its pores and embolize itself. There is a third way in which embolism occurs. We talked about nucleation sites. If a tree has a fungal infection in its wood, often the fungus will deliberately degrade and damage the lining of the xylem vessels and the pores which connect them. And that can also lead to an embolism. And often the fungi which are infecting um, woody stems deliberately like to create embolisms because it means that there's air. And under those aerobic conditions where oxygen's present, they can grow a lot more efficiently and be healthier, and that gives them an upper hand over the tree. So trees have to have pretty sophisticated mechanisms for combating fungal pathogens and other decay organisms, and we'll be exploring that a little bit more as we go on as well. Um, so that means that basically plants, these woody plants, they need to be able to make new xylem each year, not just because they're growing more branches and more leaves as they get bigger, and they need to support a larger canopy of leaves, but also because every single year they're losing uh, xylem vessels to embolisms. And those embolized sapwood xylem vessels become heartwood over time. So um, plants basically need a way of constantly adding new layers of xylem tissue every single year. So we're going to explore how they do that. They do that using their vascular cambium. Um, Vascular cambium is a secondary meristem, so it doesn't result in stem elongation. It only results in thickening of the stem or an increase in the girth of the stem. Um, If you look at this diagram, there are two faces to the vascular cambium. There's an inner face and an outer face. The inner face produces new xylem, and the outer face produces new phloem tissues. And it's the growth of the vascular cambium, it's the production of xylem every year at the vascular cambium that produces those annual growth rings within a tree. Every year, the vascular cambium lays down more tissue and more tissue and more tissue, and that's what we're looking at. There is no phloem in the wood of a tree. The wood of a tree is entirely xylem. The phloem is just this thin layer right under the bark. Um, yeah, awesome. So everything within the vascular cambium we refer to as xylem. Everything that's outside the vascular cambium we call bark. Um, just outside the vascular cambium, we have the bark, right? And the first layer is the phloem. So hopefully this is a review. Phloem is the living transport tissue, which translocates sugars, amino acids, and other products of photosynthesis. Sometimes these are just called photosynthates, up and down the stem. It's soft, it's just under the hard bark of a woody plant, and it's often referred to as inner bark because of that. And you might be wondering why I've included this image of a porcupine. Well, you can imagine that if you've got this soft, sugary tissue right underneath the outer bark, then any animal with the ability to get through the outer bark might be interested in that as a snack. So a lot of animals, deer in the winter often eat phloem. They'll eat the bark of trees in order to survive the winter. Porcupines and beavers are bark specialists. They're phloem specialists. That is their primary food source. Um, and even people in some cultures consume bark. Native Americans and also Scandinavian peoples um, famously have consumed the bark of certain species of trees that have palatable phloem. And it is highly nutritious. It's a good source of sugar. Often it does taste sweet, but you don't really, I should say, when human beings consume phloem, you don't normally eat it. You chew it to extract all the sugar, and then you spit out the fiber because the fiber, a lot of times when people are eating this, it's for survival during a really bad winter. And you don't really want to be consuming large amounts of fiber because that is going to make your digestive system do a lot of work for very little return. So it makes more sense to just kind of chew on it, extract the sugars by kind of sucking on it, and then spitting out the waste. Cork cambium. This is the layer just outside the phloem, and the cork cambium is another secondary meristem that is responsible for replacing the epidermis in woody plants. So it basically produces new layers of cork, or like that outer bark, the stuff that we typically think of as bark, on the outside face. And cork itself is just these accumulated layers of old epidermis. So when you look at the bark of a lot of trees, it's kind of cracked, or it will have fissures, or it will peel away. And that's basically because on the inside of the trunk, inside the vascular cambium, we're adding new layers of xylem every single year. So the trunk is getting thicker, and the old dead bark on the outside, it can't stretch, so it just splits open in order to accommodate the thickening that's occurring inside. And then the other thing that's occurring is the cork cambium every year is producing this new layer, this new thin layer of cork. And so there's not just an increasing thickness of wood that's occurring, but also newer and larger layers of cork being laid down under the existing bark. So the outermost layers end up developing fissures to accommodate the expansion. Or some trees like birches, they just actually shed their bark almost like a lizard would in order to allow that trunk to expand. Cork is extraordinarily valuable for trees for a number of reasons. Cork helps protect woody plant stems. That's one of the biggest functions. It can protect them from herbivores. Um, so, if an herbivore doesn't have the right teeth to chew through the bark to get at that phloem, if a tree can grow thick enough bark that a herbivore can't get to the phloem, that's always an advantage. Um, the cork can also be very protective against fires. So, in the Western United States, we have many species which are specifically fire adapted through their having a very thick layer of cork. A really good example in this bottom right image is the ponderosa pine. Two species native to Idaho that have very fire resistant bark are the ponderosa pine and the Douglas fir. And their strategy is basically to produce so much cork that the temperature inside of the cork, the cambium and the phloem, never gets so hot that those tissues are killed, and that allows them to survive low-level wildfires. Um, Another species of tree that has really, really thick cork as an adaptation to fire is the cork oak. Cork oaks are native to the Mediterranean, in like France and Spain and Italy, and then also like Israel and a lot of countries in North Africa, Morocco. And they're adapted to these oak savanna environments, which also frequently see fire. So they have this extraordinarily thick bark that grows very, very fast, or I should say, very thick cork. The tree lays down a lot of cork each year. And when you look at this image here, you would think that stripping the bark off of the tree might kill it. But in the case of cork oaks, they're not actually harvesting the bark all the way down to the vascular cambium, or to the phloem. And so they're really just removing the outer dead layers of cork down to the cork cambium. And that cork cambium can just produce new cork. So cork oaks can be harvested about every decade, about once every 10 years. And those sheets of bark can then go to factories and get the corks that we use to cork up our like wine bottles, punched out of the bark. Bark has been used for a lot of other things throughout human history, like the construction of canoes and roofing, and overall very, very useful material. Cork also prevents the loss of water from the trunk. It's often got a lot of compounds called suberins in it that are kind of waxy and prevent water loss. Um, and the last kind of big thing that cork does for the tree is it protects it from solar radiation. So you can imagine that if you've got an exposed tree trunk sitting in the sun all day, there's a risk that you're going to cook the tissues of the phloem and the vascular cambium. So by having a thick insulating layer of cork, um, woody plants can prevent damage to the living tissues just under the cork. And then cork is also frequently referred to as outer bark or the phellem. Outer bark is a term you hear a lot in the forestry industry. People talk about outer bark and inner bark. The inner bark being the phloem, the outer bark being the cork cambium and the cork. Um, One of my favorite features of bark are the lenticels. Lenticels are these breathing pores that trees have in their bark to allow for gas exchange. So anywhere we've got living cells, those cells have to do cellular respiration in order to live. They need to be able to consume food, they need to be able to do work, and they can't do that if they don't have oxygen. So um, a lot of trees have these little softer areas where oxygen can, or I should say, where gas exchange can occur. Um, a lot of the time in dormant trees, lenticels are one of the best ways to identify a species. So, for example, this tree on the left with the very beautiful metallic red bark is a Tibetan cherry. And Tibetan cherries have these very, very long, corky lenticels um, sporadically up the trunk. This top right-hand image with the green bark is actually a willow, and willows have these kind of protruding, round, spongy um, lenticels. Just below that, we have a birch with its horizontal lenticels, but which are much smaller than a cherry still. And then below that, we've got these diamond-shaped lenticels of a species of poplar. So these lenticels can be really useful for ID because they often are different shapes or textures. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into these annual growth rings now. So these annual growth rings are produced each year as that vascular cambium, which is just under the bark, lays down a new layer of wood and then stops when the plant goes dormant each year, either due to a dry season or due to winter if we're in the temperate zone. Um, but what is it that actually creates the appearance of rings? Wouldn't we, couldn't we stop without there being like a different color and restart again without there being a different color? So um, the reason there's a change in the color is because the growth rate of the plant changes throughout the growing season. So um, earlier in the growing season, the wood tends to grow very fast and it's a little bit less dense, and that's called the early wood. So there's this lighter band of wood produced in the early spring to early summer. Conditions are really good, growth is really fast, and the wood is slightly less dense. The late wood is this darker band of wood that is produced later in the summer and autumn. And it's a little bit denser because the growth is starting to slow down and that plant is preparing for dormancy. And often the tree is concerned about, I mean, trees don't have brains, so they're not really concerned about anything, but evolution is concerned for trees. So trees have evolved then to basically have more structural reinforcement in that late wood by having a greater concentration of fiber cells, which we'll talk about in a minute. So early wood is that pale, um, usually thicker band, not always, but this pale band early in the year, and then the late wood is the darker band. And that just restarts every single year. We lay down early wood, then late wood, then dormancy. Early wood, late wood, then dormancy. And the thickness of each band can tell us something about the growing conditions in that year. So, looking at this tree cookie, um, we can see that some bands are quite thick and some bands are quite thin. And we can also see that there are kind of patterns of several good years and then a couple bad years where it's thinner rings, and then a couple good years where there was a lot of growth, and then several bad years where it's thinner growth. The thicker growth rings indicate good growing conditions during that particular growing season. So usually the biggest factor is water. So you're looking at how much rain fell. Um, and in years where there's heavy rainfall throughout the season, trees tend to grow more. If you have a year of drought or several years of drought, you often see very, very, very narrow, tight growth rings because the tree was not able to afford to grow very much that year due to an inadequate water supply. Um, because of that, you can look at trees and basically create rainfall records using these annual growth rings. And you can do this even with dead trees. Um, if that dead tree was alive at the same time as a living tree, even for just part of its lifetime, you can actually match up particular years of drought or heavy rainfall, kind of like a barcode, and you can figure out, okay, this, I can line up the rings of this tree and this tree and figure out, okay, this year was, the horrible drought of 1892. And what you can do then is you can progressively date older and older and older and older trees and construct climate histories over um, hundreds or even thousands of years. Um, when we look at these growth rings, there's a couple different strategies. I won't discuss them in great detail here, but I think it's valuable to be aware of. Um, so trees can basically develop their early wood and their late wood differently. There's a couple different main patterns. This first one we're going to look at is ring porosity or being ring porous. Um, Ring porous species lay down these really huge um, xylem vessels during their early season growth, and then they produce really tiny xylem vessels in their late wood. And producing these really large xylem vessels basically allows these trees to get a jump start on really efficiently moving large amounts of water early in the season. The problem with these larger vessels is that they're more likely to embolize and get an air bubble in them, which makes them less functional. So, um, trees that have ring porous wood, they tend to have a lot of heartwood because the vessels embolize pretty easily. But there are some advantages regarding uh, like drought tolerance later in the summer with the smaller vessels that are less likely to embolize and some other features. So basically, ring porosity is more common in the temperate zone where trees need to be able to grow really fast early in the spring, and then when there's a lot of water, and then in the summer when it's hot and drier, conserve water. Diffuse porous species, they lay down early wood vessels, which are the same size as their late wood vessels. So there's no like obvious difference in vessel size throughout each ring. Um, and they can't get going as fast in the year, but because all of their vessels are smaller, they're much less likely to embolize during the winter due to the freeze thaw cycle. And then some species are between the two and they're semi-ring porous, so they produce really large vessels early in the year and then gradually produce smaller and smaller vessels as the growing season continues. And that's kind of an attempt to mix the best of both worlds to produce some vessels which are maybe more resistant to embolizing in the smaller vessels, but then the larger vessels allow them to more efficiently move large amounts of water early in the growth season to support really rapid spring growth. Another feature in wood that isn't actually xylem tissue, I probably shouldn't have titled this slide with xylem in it, but medullary rays are these tissues that radiate out from the center of the trunk at a 90-degree angle to the annual growth rings. And those medullary rays are not really composed of xylem, but they are found within the um, xylem tissues. They're actually composed of these tissues called parenchyma cells, and these parenchyma cells are thinner walled and softer. We'll talk about them more in depth later. Um, but those are actually living tissues within the xylem. So these medullary rays are allowing resources to move um, radially through the trunk, so water can be transported from the center outward, and also like things like antifungal materials can be transported by the medullary rays into the center of the trunk to protect the heartwood from decay. Um, they're also at least partially responsible for the formation of tyloses in heartwood xylem. And you might be wondering, what is a tylosis? Um, so you can imagine that the heartwood, being dead, is particularly susceptible to decay by fungus. And so trees often want to come up with ways to limit the growth of fungus throughout the heartwood. So what can happen is the tyloses are formed by parenchyma cells. So these are thinner, um, thinner walled cells that basically will protrude through a pore in the lining of the xylem tube, and they will basically um, flop into the xylem tube, and they'll form a compartmentalizing wall, and then they'll die. That process is called tylosis. And because these cells are basically squeezing through little holes into the xylem vessels and then forming these walls and dying, there's a physical barrier then to the hyphae of internal decay fungus. So hyphae are basically these filamentous threads of fungus. So if you've ever seen like mold, um, and how it looks like, little threads or hairs, um, those are these filamentous growths that make up the mycelium, and the mycelium is the body of a fungus. So you can imagine that if there's a fungal infection within the heartwood of the tree, it's going to want to race up these xylem tubes because they're like little highways. And if you can, have all these walls in the way, it really slows down the advance of fungus through these xylem vessels and prevents the tree from losing that heartwood, which often is providing significant structural support to the trunk. Another defensive ability that trees have to protect themselves from herbivores and insects and fungus are resins. Um, Resins are also called gums, and resins are not the same as sap. Sap is what's flowing through the phloem, and that's mostly kind of sugary fluid that is also high in amino acids. Resins are very, very, very different. So resins tend to be very, very viscous, whereas sap tends to be very runny. And resins are really rich in um, I just thought of a really good example. So, if you're familiar with maple syrup is made from the sap from the phloem of maple trees. And maple syrup is relatively runny, and it's relatively runny even after it's been concentrated by cooking it over a fire to evaporate extra water to make it more concentrated. So sap is sugary and it's quite liquidy and fluid, whereas resins are much more viscous, and they tend to, rather than being sweet, be very, very aromatic. So resins are primarily defensive, and they're often toxic. They're usually very antibacterial, antifungal, insecticidal, and they also deter herbivores. And they do that with aromatic compounds. So aromatic, we think of fragrant compounds, but what makes them fragrant or aromatic often is this carbon ring structure. You can see in this top image on the left that I've got, this is a diagram of the chemical benzene, but this is just kind of an example of an aromatic compound with these carbon rings. Um, Often these aromatic compounds have multiple rings attached to one another. They can be a lot of different shapes, but often they're strongly antimicrobial, insecticidal, or help protect the tree from herbivores. And because these chemicals in the resin are quite hostile to cellular life, the tree actually doesn't store them in living tissues, and it doesn't move them through living tissues. Living cells secrete the resin into resin canals. These resin canals are not really vessels because they're not made of cells themselves. They're just bordered by cells. So they're basically just tunnels that the tree has in their wood specifically for transporting resins. And I just wanted to look at some of these examples. I'm sure you've seen like gobs of resin oozing out of trees with insect infestations. In this middle right hand image, you can see that there's actually a mountain pine beetle that has gotten glued or stuck in the resin that was secreted when the beetle tried to bore into the trunk. And not only does that kind of gum up the body of the insect, but it also often is insecticidal enough to actually kill them. Um, and the bottom image is a microscopic image of a resin canal, and you can see that it's bordered by cells, but there's no living cells inside of that tube. And this image of the wood that we have in the center, the little polka dots on it, the little dark spots, those are resin canals in this pine sample that would be transporting resins throughout the wood. Um, Xylem itself is composed of a couple different cell types. We're going to talk about both some of the vascular cells and some of the supportive cells that make up xylem. The first are tracheids. So tracheids are these really, really narrow xylem cells, and they are covered in little pits or pores. These pits allow them to transfer water horizontally from one tracheid to another, and you can see that in this diagram on the right-hand side. Um, Tracheids were one of the very first types of xylem cells to evolve. In fact, if you look at really early fossil plants that are, older than 150 million years ago, they only will have xylem tissues composed of tracheids. They will only have tracheids, and that's something that is conserved in our kind of more primitive land plants today. For example, conifers only have tracheids as vascular xylem in their stems. Um, so they lack the vessel elements that we see in the angiosperms or the flowering plants. The next type of water conducting or vascular xylem that we have are the vessel elements. The vessel elements have a much larger lumen. The lumen is just the space inside of the tube. They're much larger diameter than tracheids. Being larger allows the vessel elements to transport much greater quantities of water much more rapidly than is possible with tracheids. So the benefit there is a plant which is rapidly growing, in this case an angiosperm, because only the angiosperms or flowering plants produce um, vessel elements. They can then supply a lot of water relatively quickly to a very large surface area of leaves, which allows them to do a lot of photosynthesis and grow quite rapidly. Um, Angiosperms originally evolved in the tropics, and to this day, there are very, very, very few conifers that can outcompete or even keep up with angiosperms in the tropics. Tropical rainforests are composed of almost entirely angiosperm species because these vessel elements provide such a major advantage in terms of growth rate due to their ability to supply large amounts of water to the canopy. It also allows the plants, angiosperm plants, to have larger, broader leaves, which capture sunlight more efficiently. Vessel elements do have some traits in common with tracheids, so they still have the pits that we see in tracheids, but they also have these perforation plates that connect one vessel element to the next and create these continuous tubes that go all the way up the trunk. And when you look at hardwood samples that have pores, right, like our ring porous wood or our diffuse porous wood, those pores that we're looking at, those are the vessel elements of that wood. You'll never find vessel elements or pores in the wood of conifers because the wood of conifers is composed entirely of tracheids. And this bottom diagram I really like because it shows some of the ways that um, woody plants can compartmentalize embolisms and still make their wood work even when an air bubble has formed within a xylem tube. These pits allow water to be transferred from one xylem tube to a neighboring xylem tube so that water flow can still occur, both in vessel elements and in tracheids. We see an embolized vessel element in the left-hand picture and an embolized tracheid in the right-hand picture. And we can see that the water is still capable of flowing around embolisms, even in partially embolized wood. Fiber cells, I think I've got a mistake here. I made these slides and I was doing a little bit more reading and determined that probably in most species of angiosperms or flowering plants, the fiber cells are probably not water conducting. Um, but that's fine. Just ignore that part. So fiber cells are probably not water conducting, but they are xylem cells, which produce a really, really thick reinforced cell wall. And fiber cells are a major component in the wood of angiosperms, but not in the wood of conifers. Um, Fiber cells are basically the workaround for the density problem that a tree would have by having wood composed of vessel elements. So the vessel elements, because they have such a large lumen or such a large space inside, wood that is composed of vessel elements is very lightweight and not very dense, which means it's also not very strong. Angiosperms, when they figured out these vessel elements, they're like, this is awesome, right? I can move tons of water, but now my wood is kind of weak. So what they did is they modified some of their tracheids to have super, super thick walls and produce these fiber cells. And the fiber cells allow that wood to still be structurally strong enough to not collapse. Um, Both the vessel elements and fibers are evolved from these as basically specialized tracheids. Tracheids being the oldest type of vascular xylem tissue, and the vessel elements and the fibers being kind of derived forms of tracheids. Um, because conifers and angiosperms have pretty different wood structure, they're often used by people in different ways, and we usually refer to them as hardwoods and softwoods. So hardwoods are produced by angiosperm species. So if at home you have a hardwood floor, or if you have any wooden furniture, or wooden cabinets, or wooden doors, um, those are typically going to be made from hardwoods. So hardwoods are composed of tracheids, vessel elements, and also fiber cells. And due to the high concentration of fiber cells in hardwood species, they tend to be much, much harder. The hardness can also make them a little bit brittle. So compared to like pine, a lot of or Douglas fir, a lot of the hardwoods are relatively more brittle. So if you bend them, they're more likely to snap, but they're much less likely to get dented or get dings in them from day-to-day use. So you can walk on a maple hardwood floor in stiletto heels and not put holes in the floor. Whereas if you walk on a pine floor in stiletto heels, you're going to put you basically crush the wood and put little dimples all over your floor, which is not going to be particularly attractive on a wood floor. Um, Often these hardwoods have really beautifully figured wood. So compared to conifers, which tend to have a really defined central leader and then lateral branches, the angiosperms or the flowering plants tend to be a little bit more loosey goosey with the way that they grow their branches. And so sometimes you'll get these really beautiful patches of distorted grain within a tree, and those are really highly valued for making furniture and musical instruments. And yeah, hardwoods are just more suitable for flooring, furniture, and veneers, which are those thin sheets of really pretty hardwood that are overlaid on cheaper furniture that's made out of things like plywood. Softwoods, by comparison, they're produced by coniferous species, so things like pines, spruces, firs, hemlock, Douglas fir, um, and their wood is composed primarily of tracheids. The conifers do not have vessel elements. As far as I'm aware, they do not have fiber cells. They don't really need them because the tracheids themselves are suitable structurally. They're smaller and they've got less empty space in them, so they're a little bit stronger. Um, Softwoods lack pores, so you won't find ring porous or diffuse porous softwoods. They don't have vessel elements, so there are no pores. Um, on average, due to the growth habit of conifers, the grain of the wood tends to be straighter. Their wood is also softer because they lack the fiber cells found in hardwoods, and their wood tends to be more flexible. So, because the softwoods are a little bit springier almost because of that flexibility, they're really suitable for construction and for structural framing, because they are strong woods. They're just not hard. So they're unlikely to snap in a windstorm, for example. They can bend and flex, which is something you want in construction, but um, they're just not hard enough to use for making high quality furniture or flooring. This is just for fun, something that any musicians in the group might appreciate. So, not all woods are equally well suited for the construction of musical instruments. The people who make wooden instruments are called luthiers, and luthiers often prefer certain types of wood over others for making musical instruments for two main reasons. The first is workability. The wood needs to be kind of soft enough that it's easy to carve, and it needs to not like crack or split easily, so that they can actually take a piece of wood and make it into an instrument without it, um, breaking in the process. And then the other thing that really matters is how well does that wood vibrate? Does it produce really rich tones when that musical instrument is played? So tone woods are woods with these superior workability and vibrational characteristics. So the luthier can actually work with the wood, and then once it's made into an instrument, it makes these really kind of rich sounds. And yeah, so certain musicians, for example, they may prefer musical instruments made out of certain woods because of that. Um, our last type of xylem cells that we'll be talking about are the parenchyma cells. So, unlike most of the other cells, well, all the other cells that we've been talking about in the xylem, the parenchyma cells are actually living, which is kind of crazy because they're completely surrounded by dead cells. There's just these little strands of living tissue running through the xylem that basically run the whole show. Um, so the xylem's moving water, but because it's dead, um, it can't mount any kind of defense strategy. So I like to think of the parenchyma cells as kind of the immune system almost of the inside of the trunk. There are a couple different kinds, but generally the parenchyma cells, they're thinner walled living cells, and they contribute to the formation of tyloses, which are those little walls that are made inside the xylem once it's embolized in order to prevent the spread of um, fungal filaments through the xylem vessels. There are a couple different kinds. So paratracheal parenchyma, these are the strands of parenchymal tissue that are right around the fibers. So if we look at this microscope image in the bottom, we can see our vessel elements, which are very, very large. And we can see that our vessel elements are surrounded by these thinner walled groups of cells, and that is our paratracheal parenchyma. And so once that xylem vessel embolizes, one of those paratracheal parenchyma, or actually many of them, can basically like prolapse through one of the pits into the lumen or the inner chamber of that xylem vessel, and it can tylose and form that sheet of or that wall that prevents fungus from spreading. Apotracheal parenchyma, they're found away from the xylem tubes. They're kind of scattered throughout the tissue, and they're involved in the tree's response to decay organisms as well. And then the ray parenchyma we've already talked about when we talked about our medullary rays. These are radial strands of parenchymous tissues that are transporting things into or out of the center of the trunk. Um, Often they're involved in, once again, defenses against either insect or fungal pathogens or decay organisms. Um, so we've talked about the kind of overall gross anatomy of wood, the different layers. We've talked now about the cell types. Now we're getting down to the chemical composure of wood. So when you think about a tree that's maybe just been freshly cut down, it's about 50% water by weight. So this is one of the reasons why fresh firewood doesn't burn very well. You have to let your firewood dry for about a year in order for it to burn well. And if you've dried your wood all the way, like if I were to take a piece of wood and put it in the oven and evaporate all of the water out of it, the remainder of the weight, or the dry weight, is mostly composed of the cell walls of those xylem cells, the tracheids, the vessel elements, and the fiber cells. The cell walls themselves are composed of this biopolymer, which is basically a polymer is just any kind of material that's made out of kind of multiple um, subunits, or it's got little parts that are stuck together. Um, and there are three main components. There's cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Cellulose you may have heard of. If you're wearing a cotton shirt right now, you are, or if you're wearing like denim jeans, then you are wearing clothing made out of cellulose. Cellulose is actually a polysaccharide. Poly means many, saccharum means sugar, so they're just these chains of sugar. So um, cellulose is an unbranched beta-linked polymer of glucose, and that might sound like it's mumbo jumbo, but if you look at this image that I've provided at the top, you can see that the linkages between these carbon rings, these different sugar molecules, they alternate which direction they point, where that oxygen connects the two. And those are called beta linkages, and they're much harder to break than alpha linkages. When you string together simple sugars into starches, they're linked differently than they are in cellulose, and so they're relatively easy to break down. And starches don't form straight fibers the way that cellulose does. The alpha linkages of starches cause them to curl up like a curlicue and form granules rather than fibers. So glucose is a simple sugar, and that's the product of the photosynthesis reaction. And what plants do is they make a glucose, and then they beta link one glucose to another glucose to another glucose to another glucose to make these cellulose fibers, which, because they have the bonds on alternating sides that link them, they actually are able to stay relatively straight. Um, Unlike glucose, cellulose is really fibrous and those bonds are really hard to break, which makes cellulose indigestible for most organisms. So when we look at animals that eat a lot of plant material like cattle or sheep or goats or gazelles, um, they actually don't have the ability to break down cellulose. What they have to do is they have to recruit bacteria to ferment that cellulose to break it down, because the bacteria do have the enzymes to break it down, but the animals don't. Um, Fungi can also do this. They can break down cellulose and get energy from the sugar. But you or I, we do not have the digestive tract to be able to do that. So if you tried to keep a human being alive on tree leaves and grass and even our vegetables, which are bred to be more nutritious, you wouldn't be able to stay in good health, because human digestive tracts don't have the ability to break the bonds between cellulose molecules to absorb the nutrition from the glucose or the sugar. And most of the dry weight of a plant is cellulose. That's probably the biggest component in the cell walls of these plants. Hemicellulose is a relatively minor component, but it's really important for linking some of the different components together. So it's another branch, it's another beta-linked polymer of glucose, but it's branched rather than being unbranched. And it's able to link to glucose really efficiently, and it also provides additional strength and flexibility to the cell wall. The last component of wood that I want to talk about is lignin. Lignins are really structurally complex. There's a couple different main kind of alcohols that bond together over and over and over and over and over and over again to build these really large, complex lignin molecules. Um, but basically lignin hardens and cross-links cellulose and hemicellulose fibers, which really increases the strength of fibers in the stem. Another really cool thing about lignin is that it's super resilient and it's really challenging to decompose. And so the more lignin there is in the wood, the harder it is for things like fungus to break it down. And in fact, lignin was such a kind of a big evolutionary um, jump that it actually created coal. So because lignin is necessary to reinforce these structural fibers in stems, it's really what allowed plants to start growing taller and stand upright. Um, and because it doesn't break down very well, what that means is in our early the first forest on Earth during the Carboniferous period, um, the trunks of our first trees, which were still producing spores, they didn't really decompose because there were no organisms that had yet evolved any ability to break down lignins. So in the Carboniferous forest, when trees fell, they just laid there on the forest floor, and all the leaf litter that had lignins in it built up on the forest floor, and it just built up and built up and built up and built up and built up, and then under its own weight started to convert to coal, especially as things like landslides and sedimentation covered up older areas of like log and leaf litter buildup in these Carboniferous forests and compressed it and turned it into coal. So our coal beds are actually absolutely full of fossils. For example, in this image of a coal fossil, you can see a stem with all the scars where the leaves would have been attached to the stem. Coal beds are absolutely full of plant fossils because um, no organisms had yet evolved the ability to decompose lignin. Today in forests, we know that logs rot and that fungus can break them down, which actually means that coal could no longer form on Earth. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are concerned about the ongoing burning of coal, is that you can't recapture the carbon that's burned from coal as coal permanently in the earth. All the coal that has ever been laid down already exists, and we can only burn it. No more coal can form because the fungi figured out how to decompose lignins. So any carbon released into the atmosphere from the burning of coal is permanently in the atmosphere, and we can pull it out. But using photosynthesis, a tree could pull that carbon out of the atmosphere, but its woody tissues are going to be decomposed back into carbon dioxide by fungus today. So um, looking again at the fibers, right? The fibers of the wood, they're composed of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, and they form this. They basically cross-link with each other to form these really, really strong fibers that make up the cell walls. And together, they're a really strong structural polymer, and that's what makes up the majority of the dry weight of wood is cellulose, lignin, and hemicellulose, which are those, like I said, strong components of the cell wall. Um, Woody stems also have some external anatomy that a lot of herbaceous stems don't have because woody stems are permanent and usually herbaceous stems are a little bit more temporary and don't typically survive winters. So we'll look at a couple of those external features. The first external feature we'll look at are the leaf scars. So leaf scars are left behind when a leaf is abscised or shed. On this horse chestnut stem, you can see this heart-shaped scar. That's where the petiole of the leaf attached to the stem, and they're always going to be found at a node, usually just below an axillary bud. Within that leaf scar, we can see the bundle scars. So in this leaf scar, we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bundle scars. So those bundle scars, they represent the vascular bundles which were transporting water and mineral nutrients into the leaf through the xylem, and which were transporting photosynthates like sugars and amino acids out of the leaf through the phloem. And that's a feature that can be useful for the identification of certain groups. Um, We also, in our woody species, especially our temperate woody species, we often see bud scales. And bud scales are these thickened, modified leaves, and they're protecting the dormant apical meristems and also axillary meristems during the winter. So they are often these really, really thick, waxy, or hairy leaves that are protective in nature. Um, because those bud scales are shed each year when growth resumes at the stem tip, they leave behind these little bud scale scars, which are densely or tightly packed, narrow little scars when they're upsized at the beginning of each growth season. So if you want to figure out how much primary growth a tree did in a certain year, you can measure the distance between the current bud scales and the bud scale scar to say, oh, okay, this branch grew 6 inches this year, or this branch grew um, 10 inches this year, right? And then what you can do is you can count from that bud scale scar back to the older bud scale scar to figure out how much it grew the year before that, right? Often you can count you can measure primary growth over the last 3 to 5 years by looking back at these bud scale scars. Eventually, they do become obscured as the bark thickens, and you can't see them anymore. But certainly on younger branches, you can monitor year to year growth. And that's a really good way to evaluate the health of plants in a nursery or in your garden. Um, if you see that there are for the past several years, you've maybe only put on an inch to 3 inches of growth, your growth conditions may not be suitable, or your woody plant might have something wrong with it. So it's always a good idea to kind of be monitoring how much did that woody plant grow this year, and is it in a good growing condition. Looking at the buds, I just wanted to talk a little bit about bud phenology. So, we talk about apical buds and apical meristem, but there's kind of a difference between active and dormant buds. So, I've got three buds in sequence here. At the top, we can see an open or active bud that's undergoing active growth. We can see that there are small developing leaves emerging from that bud. And that's typically going to be observable from the early spring to the early summer in hardy temperate plants. In the image just below that, you can see that we only have fully developed leaves, and that the end of the stem actually now has a little bud with bud scales, little green bud scales covering it. So this bud is now dormant, and it's protected by bud scales. And they can have some developmental processes going on inside, but they're not undergoing active growth or stem elongation. And if you look at the very bottom, we have those fully developed dormant buds during the winter. These are all images of lilac, so it's all the same species. And an example of a developmental process that occurs within these buds is the plant actually will develop all of its inflorescences within these buds as basically tiny little compact inflorescences. So if you cut them open, you can actually find these tiny flower buds in them. Um, but they won't actually grow or expand until the coming growing season in the early spring. So they're basically getting a bunch of those structures ready inside the bud developmentally. And then once things warm up in the spring, then they grow those new shoots and flower with the flower buds that they've already formed inside of the dormant buds. Epicormic buds are another thing you see a lot in landscape species. So these are adventitious buds that are forming from the cambium of these mature woody stems. You don't typically expect to see fresh young shoots emerging from the thicker, older tissues of a trunk or branch, but it does occur. Um, and those epicormic buds, they're going to produce epicormic shoots. And those shoots, their function is mainly to help trees recover from stress and injury. So around here, you see them very commonly on trees which were severely drought stressed the year before, or for several years. They're most common, especially if the drought stress is so severe that there's some dieback of branches at the top of the trunk of the tree, and then the tree will produce all these epicormic shoots trying to recover basically produce new branches and new leaves to do photosynthesis with. Some species of woody plants will recover from damage by fire by sprouting epicormic shoots. It's also a way that they cope with things like beetle damage or insect damage in their upper branches. Even if they lose some branches, they can just sprout some younger branches from older wood and grow back up to replace any lost tissue. And it's also really common on trees which have maybe been a little over pruned. They will produce epicormic shoots to regrow branches from um, areas that, or I guess on plants that have been pruned too much. These epicormic shoots are usually considered unattractive and unsightly on ornamental landscape trees. Um, Whether I leave them or rub them off kind of depends on the situation. They can be really useful to help that tree recover and grow some new branches, but you kind of only want to leave them on maybe in areas where you actually are going to want branches to form again. Um, and I think that, we've been talking about these woody plants for so long, we haven't really even talked about like different categories of woody plants. So we often think of, trees and shrubs are both obviously woody plants. But what is the difference between a tree and a shrub? And I've provided you here an image of an Amur maple, and I've deliberately picked a species which maybe isn't super easy to define. You could say that this is a really large shrub. They grow about 20, 25 feet tall. But certainly it doesn't have a lot of the features that we classically associate with trees. So I want you to take a minute and think of some criteria. What really makes something a tree? What really makes something a shrub? What are some of the main big differences that you would say, like, oh, if a plant has this feature, it has to be a tree. If a plant has this feature, it has to be a shrub. I'm going to give you a second to think of some criteria about the difference between trees and shrubs. Maybe pause the video, write some down. I consider this to be more of a philosophical and contextual question. I don't think that trees or shrubs really exist. I think that what we're really looking at is two kind of extreme ends of a spectrum, and we're just kind of arbitrarily deciding whether or not things are going to be a tree or a shrub. In general, we see some patterns, but then I'm going to kind of deconstruct some of those patterns as we go. So we think of trees as being taller and shrubs as being shorter, trees as having fewer main stems. Typically, we think of them as having just one trunk, but we all know that's not true. We've all seen trees with multiple trunks. Um, and then shrubs, we typically think of as having more main stems, but you can certainly grow shrubs with just one main stem if you prune them to do so. Trees often have thicker stems, whereas shrubs are usually going to have thinner stems. And trees, we're going to think of them typically as having a canopy higher off the ground, which isn't always true because sometimes things like spruces have branches all the way down to the ground, and shrubs as having a canopy close to the ground. Um, but that's not true in the case of shrubs which kind of shed their lower branches or leaves because they're too shaded to do a lot of photosynthesis. So I consider this to be more of a spectrum situation. So if we look at the top two images on this slide, we've got two different cultivars of Chinese juniper, Juniperus chinensis. We've got on the left-hand side these tree-like cultivar called Spartan, and on the left we've got this shrub-like cultivar called Old Gold. And while I wouldn't disagree that Spartan is a tree and Old Gold is a shrub, it's kind of just to point out that a lot of this is kind of arbitrary. Spartan often has multiple trunks, and while Old Gold is not a plant anyone would consider a tree, they are both the same species. So you can't really say, oh, the Chinese juniper is a tree. It can be a tree or it can be a shrub. It depends on its genetics. Um, Moving down one, we've got another situation where we've got the same species, right? On the left-hand side, you might say that's a lilac tree. On the right, you'd probably say it's a lilac shrub, but they're the same cultivar. It's just pruning and the growing conditions that are resulting in that difference. Another good example would be our Rocky Mountain junipers that we have in eastern Idaho. If they're growing on a really, really low rainfall or really area or like really rocky soil, they'll often grow as a shrub no taller than 3 feet tall. But if they're on a slightly better site, they can often grow over 20 feet tall and have a single trunk and be very tree-like. So even things like rainfall can determine whether or not an individual plant is going to grow more like a shrub or more like a tree. Um, and then obviously there are species that we would, never call a shrub. So for example, like a giant sequoia, definitely a tree, right? Or like this Edgeworthia in the bottom right-hand corner, it's definitely a shrub. It's never going to get, tall enough for us to consider that a tree. But I want you to be kind of aware that trees and shrubs kind of aren't real. There's kind of a continuous spectrum between the two, and there are a lot of species, like lilacs are the perfect example of a species that can sometimes be considered a tree and sometimes considered a shrub. Amur maples are another one. Tatarian maples are another one. Um, Seven sunflower tree is another one. There's a lot of trees and and shrubs, I suppose you could say, that kind of flirt with the boundary between the two. A lot of this is also just influenced by our own cultural context or tradition. So, there are certain areas in the world where certain species are grown with a single trunk, like a tree, and in other areas of the world, they're grown more as a shrub. A good example would be cherry laurels in Europe. Cherry laurels are often grown as a tree. In the United States, we like to use them for hedging, so they're more often grown as a shrub. So there's some variability there. Culturally as well. Um, Internal decay is a big problem in landscape trees. So I want to kind of talk through the cause and effect of internal decay. So the heartwood at the center of the tree is dead tissue, so it's susceptible to decay when it's exposed to decay organisms. So, for example, maybe someone does construction near a large tree and they're digging with a backhoe, and the backhoe digs through one of these big roots and splinters this big root apart, right? Now we've got an opening into the heartwood of that root. And because the heartwood is continuous throughout all the woody stems and roots of a tree, it's kind of this highway through the middle of the tree of dead tissue. So that allows the spread of decay throughout the interior of the plant. You could have decay organisms work their way up from a root all the way up the trunk, all the way up into some pretty high branches. Or vice versa. You could have a bad pruning cut or a branch that breaks off in a windstorm. You've got exposed heartwood, and now the infection could work its way from the top of the tree down to the roots. So that's a big problem, especially since a lot of trees rely on their heartwood for structural support. So, because a lot of species rely on their heartwood for structural support, most trees need to have a way of stopping or slowing the spread of decay organisms through their heartwood, or they'll lose that structural support and then their stem can structurally fail and they can fall. Um, we really care about preventing internal decay in horticulture for a number of reasons. I want you to think about some of them. Maybe consider this image here for a minute to help you think of some. You can even pause the video to write some down if you want. I there's a lot for me. So property damage is a big one. Trees can fall on houses, they can fall on cars. Hazards to human safety and human life. They can fall on people, they can fall on children, they can fall on your grandma. You need to be aware of that and be making sure that trees are monitored. Trees that you're in charge of are monitored to make sure that they are staying healthy. And also, these really large landscape trees, when they die, it's often very emotionally catastrophic for people that this happens to, not just because of the cost of cleaning it up, but because they've lost this huge, big, beautiful shade tree, which was providing them with a lot of, um, services, right? So, you can't just go out to the nursery and buy a replacement for a 50 or 100-year old shade tree in a landscape. So, um, it's about investments and safety and just keeping our trees healthy to maintain beautiful landscapes. Trees do have ways of preventing internal decay, and healthy trees that are kept healthy, are much more resistant to internal decay. But it requires you to keep your trees well watered and well fed and make sure that conditions for them are good. Um, I'm not going to go into the nitty gritty details of this, but I want you to be aware of the compartmentalization of decay in trees, or CODIT. Um, this is basically a model for understanding ways in which trees can stop or slow the spread of decay organisms in all planes through the heartwood. So if you look at this maple trunk, we can see that there's some internal decay in the heartwood, but we can see that the tree has effectively prevented it from spreading radially on either side. So we have this kind of fan shape above and fan shape below, and then we have these wedges on the side where the fungus was not able to infect. And that's because the tree is using its medullary rays. It's secreting antifungal um, compounds and creating thick walls, thick wood walls right along the border of the infection. And the combination of creating these thicker layers of wood and then secreting antifungal compounds is the medullary rays of the tree then are able to effectively prevent the advance of the fungus. And of course, this is a battle that's ongoing. So the walls that these medullary rays have made and the compounds that they've produced, that can fail, and the fungus can advance. But a healthy tree has a much higher chance of if really successfully compartmentalizing decay, whereas a tree which is very stressed is just not going to have the resources that it needs in order to effectively and aggressively compartmentalize and stop the advance of decay organisms through their trunk. Um, Encapsulation is related to the decay process. So when a tree is wounded, for example, by a pruning cut, it will encapsulate the wood with new tissues. So the vascular cambium is producing a new layer of xylem every year, and it's producing new phloem on the outside. So the tissue will eventually grow over the wound due to the growth that occurs at that secondary meristem at the vascular cambium, and it will eventually encapsulate and totally cover up the pruning wound. The problem with this is whenever you make a pruning wound, you're exposing heartwood. So there's always a risk when you prune a tree that the heartwood could become infected with decay organisms. And hopefully, if your tree is healthy, the tree is able to compartmentalize that successfully and it doesn't spread. But if your tree is stressed at all, you really are opening up your tree to kind of devastating heartwood infections. So um, it's really important then to be aware that the larger the stub is, the longer that heartwood is exposed. And the longer the heartwood is exposed, the more it starts to break down and the more likely you are to get decay organisms established in that heartwood. So always better to prune trees for good structure when they're younger so that the cuts are smaller and they heal faster and the heartwood is exposed for less time, and you are more likely to have a tree that stays healthy for decades or centuries rather than dying prematurely. You can see that encapsulation process. I provided images of encapsulated pruning cuts at multiple different stages. So the first stage is a fresh pruning cut. Then we've got a partial encapsulation in the middle image, and then on the far right-hand side in the top corner, we have this completely fully encapsulated pruning wound. In the bottom image, we can see that this maple had some really, really, really large branches removed, and it's done a really good job of trying to encapsulate. It's grown several inches of new tissue over the pruning wound, but the pruning wound was so large that it was never going to be able to heal in time. And so that heartwood got infected, and now we can see that it's actually weeping fluid. Um, and that means we probably have a bacterial infection in our heartwood that's causing that seeping behavior. So that's no good. And we really want to try our best to use sanitary pruning tools, make sure to disinfect between different trees, and yeah, make sure you do most of your structural pruning when a tree is young, because if you try to remove larger branches, you're really flirting with danger. Last thing I want to, well, this isn't totally the last thing I want to talk about. We're getting near the end. Are borers and galleries. So galleries are tunnels. Think about like an art gallery, right? There's all these hallways with different types of art to look at. So insects love art, so they make their own galleries. And these are basically the tunnels chewed by the insects through the wood. Um, and the shape of the gallery um, can tell us a lot about the species or genus of insects which is feeding on a tree. So when we look at this gallery in the top photo, you can see that there's a kind of a central hallway, and then there are these curling lateral galleries off of that central hallway, which was chewed by the insect. And that is a defining feature of the elm bark beetles. They make these really elaborate galleries. Some other species have really straight galleries or really squiggly galleries. Some of them are just in the phloem where there's a lot of sugar. Some of these insects actually like to eat the wood that's deeper in the trunk. Um, so you can often figure out what group of insects is feeding on your tree just by looking at the gallery. Insects that do this are usually referred to as borers, and healthy trees are not very attractive to boring insects because they're able to mount very aggressive chemical defenses against borers. So um, we looked at resins earlier and how boring beetles often get gooped up with resins when they try to chew their way into the trunk of a tree. Because of that, boring beetles, and there are also some caterpillars and some wasps that do this. They prefer to attack trees which are already stressed, especially by drought, because they're much less likely to be able to mount an aggressive um, defensive response and successfully fend off the beetles. Healthy trees with adequate water, they usually respond by producing resins, which um, are really effective at stopping the beetles. Um, Another big problem with these borers, though, is a lot of them are vectors of plant diseases or internal decay organisms. So the elm bark beetle, for example, it transmits a disease called Dutch elm disease. And when you look at this lower image, the reason this elm tree is dying is because it's become infected with um, Dutch elm disease due to which it got from the elm bark beetles. The elm bark beetles carried it from one tree that they hatched out of as a baby. They flew to a new tree to feed and lay eggs, and that's how they spread the disease from one tree to another. Um, and That's obviously devastating. That fungus infects the vascular tissue of the elm tree, and as it infests the xylem vessels, it clogs up the xylem vessels and embolizes them, and that prevents water from being able to move through those vessels anymore, and then the tree dies. Um, some insects, like the pine bark borers, they will deliberately transmit internal decay organisms. And the fun thing about that for them is that the fungus that eats the wood is actually one of the food sources that the beetle larvae of pine bark beetles rely on. So they're carrying fungal spores on the bodies of the adults. The adults chew into a tree, they eat around in the phloem, and then they start laying eggs throughout the tunnels that they form. And then the larvae feed on the fungus that is introduced into the tree by their parents. That obviously causes internal decay. It's not a good deal for the tree, but it's very beneficial for the borer. So it's something to watch out for. If you see little holes in the bark of a tree, you've got borers, and you probably need to take some corrective action, or you might lose your landscape tree. We're just going to look at two um, types of modified woody stems. I wanted to talk about lianas. We often talk about trees and shrubs, but lianas are often ignored or just thought of as vines. Lianas are not really the same as vines. Lianas are woody plants, and they do experience secondary growth, so their older stems do get thicker. Um, this is a bad deal for trees. So lianas are basically hitchhikers. They have decided that they don't want to invest the resources into making their own stems thick enough that they can stand up on their own. So they're just going to grow their woody stems up a support that someone else has already put the effort into building. So in the wild, most lianas climb up they can climb up trees. Um, I've provided actually three ornamental plants as examples on this slide. We've got wisteria in the top left image. Below that, we have the trumpet vine. And then in the right-hand image, we have English ivy, all of which are popular landscape plants. This can cause big problems for the trees they're climbing up. So trees which are supporting lianas are much more likely to die than trees without lianas for a couple of reasons. One of the biggest ones is competition for light. That liana can grow its branches all the way out to the tips of the branches of the tree and compete with the tree's own leaves for light, which can eventually kill the tree by shading it out. And they can also kill the tree if it's a twining vine. If they climb by wrapping their stem tips around the trunk, um, then the trunk of the tree obviously wants to get thicker each year because of the growth of the vascular cambium, but the trunk of the liana is also expanding every year, so that can compress the vascular cambium and prevent it from laying down those new layers of wood, and that can interfere with the flow of sugars through the phloem and basically starve out the roots of the plant they're climbing up and cause it to die. Um, so competition for light and compression of the vascular cambium and phloem, those are big problems. Um, it's most advisable to never allow landscape lianas such as wisteria to climb in your landscape trees because if they do, and once they do, they can create a real nightmare, both for the tree itself and also for you if you ever decide to correct that condition. And then the last type of modified woody stem we'll talk about are lignotubers. So a lignotuber is basically this tuber-like thickened woody stem at the base of a tree. They're most common in species which are regularly subjected to fire. So they help these species regenerate after a severe fire event. So if we look at this image on the left-hand side, we see this charred, blackened trunk of a eucalyptus. But from the base, from the lignotuber, we've sprouted two new trunks. And that's going to allow that individual tree to continue living, even though its existing above ground structures were catastrophically burned. Another good example in the Mountain West is the Gamble oak. Please pardon the poor photo quality, but this image in the bottom right hand corner is a stand of Gamble oaks in Utah that was burned, and then from the lignotubers under the soil, they produce new shoots, and that whole stand of Gamble oak trees is just going to regrow, and it's going to be the same individual plants, but just new trunks. So that's kind of a cool adaptation that some plants have to areas with frequent wildfires. Um, I know that sometimes we can really get caught up in the science, or we think, oh my gosh, like trees are surviving so many problems. There's so many things I need to be aware of. I've got all these things I need to learn for class. But try to remember, like trees are beautiful, right? Don't ever like forget maybe why you're interested in trees or horticulture. Trees are beautiful and they do so many things for us and they're so wonderful. Trees support wildlife, they cool urban areas, they can protect us from UV radiation with shading us. They remove CO2 and pollutants from the air. They can filter and deflect urban noise and create more pleasant environments in our cities. Um, we use them to build our homes. We use them to build furniture, musical instruments. We use them to make clothing. One of the most amazing things I remember learning as a child was, in Western Washington, is that in the indigenous peoples who live around the Salish Sea, which is the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Puget Sound in British Columbia and Washington, they traditionally made all of their clothing out of the inner bark of cedar trees. So they'd peel off these big sheets of wood and then peel the inner bark off of the outer bark and then pound the fibers to soften them, and then weave them together into mats and clothing and even diapers. Um, Trees also provide food for us. They provide fruit, and they also provide inner bark of trees if you're in a survival situation, and they're used for thousands of other things as well. Trees improve our psychological well-being, and once again, they're beautiful. Okay, so try to get out this week and look at some trees around you. Try to find some of the features we've talked about um, of trees as you walk around and appreciate their beauty. Have an excellent week.